Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Lolita Chakrabarti's play, Red Velvet. So this is a really, really cool play. It's a history play. Some of you may know, if you've been longtime viewers, if such a creature exists, as I always say, that I love history plays. I think they're absolutely great. And Chakrabarti has picked up on a really kind of forgotten piece of theater history, which is the career of Ira Aldridge. He was an African American actor from New York who, in the mid-1800s, did perform in New York, and then he made the jump over to the UK. He performed in the sort of regional theater scene outside of London, and he finally made the jump to London, to the Covent Garden Theatre, where he was brought in to play the role of Othello after Edmund Kean, one of the great Shakespearean actors of the day, fell ill and was no longer able to play this role that he had played very successfully for quite a long time. Aldridge was not met with an entirely positive reception, as one might expect. This was due to a number of factors. The fact that he was taking over for Kean, who was one of the most highly regarded actors of his day, so he had big shoes to fill. Aldrich's acting style, as far as I can tell, and part of this is just from the play, seemed to be more naturalistic rather than the more sort of bombastic, melodramatic style of people like Kean. And so it was a difference from what London audiences were familiar with, etc., etc. And then, of course, there's just good old-fashioned family racism. And one of the things Chakrabarti does in this play that actually is really kind of cool, she incorporates the characters after the sort of premiere performance in which Aldridge, most of this play really revolves around that initial run, that short, it was I think quite a short run that Aldridge was allowed to play Othello at the Covent Garden. Because the press reception was so negative that it was shut down. But she incorporates what I believe to be original reviews from the time, which are, of course, horrendously racist. But this, of course, plays into some of the larger thematic elements of the play, which I'm gonna talk about. So after Aldridge, I don't want to say failed in London, because that suggests that he was somehow an insufficient performer, and that doesn't really seem to be the case. He seems to have been an amazing performer. He seems to have been an amazing Shakespearean actor. But London was not in a position, or the London theater critics were not in a position to appreciate what he was doing and the quality of his abilities. So that seems to be more accurate in terms of what happened. But once that happened, Aldridge eventually left the UK, and he went and basically had an incredibly successful career touring Eastern Europe. He played before monarchs. He was honored and given these orders of merit and things like this by all of these Eastern and Central European monarchs, princes. He played these great performances, and he was a beloved actor in Eastern Europe. So he had an incredibly successful career. But he never made it in London or New York or any place like that, the big sort of theater capitals of the Western world. So Red Velvet, again, largely focuses... there's a frame narrative where he is much older. He's actually at the point where he's dying. He dies... I forget exactly what his age was. He dies around age 60 in Lodz, Poland. It wasn't Poland at the time because Poland didn't exist. This is a tangent, but it is mentioned in the play, interestingly enough. Poland was carved up by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and as a Polish American, Polish Jewish Americans, I guess it's worth pointing out. Yeah. My ancestors' country didn't exist as a country when my ancestors left it around the turn of the 20th century. But it's now Poland. Lodz is now in Poland. And so we start out with Aldridge basically on the day that he's dying. And that sort of frames this story of him sort of looking back at when he performed in London. And of course, there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of just straight up sort of racist tension. Charles Keene, who's Edmund Keane's son, had sort of wanted to step up and take over as the lead in the company while his father was incapacitated, but Aldrich was brought in instead. Charles Keene seems to be quite racist, somewhat unapologetically so, whereas Ellen Tree, who is Charles Keene's fiancée and also the leading lady who plays Desdemona, she's initially sort of on the fence about things, but once she sees Aldrich act and starts engaging with his performance style, she finds it much more liberating, much more to her taste as a performer. So we've got all of these elements. But then there's also a lot of meta-theatrical stuff going on here. There's a lot of investigation of what it means to perform, what about the sort of politics of theater, and this, of course, is ongoing. We have, even today, these sort of questions and debates about race-blind casting, about opportunities and limits for actors of color, actors with disabilities, all of these different elements and these sort of debates about should casting directors try to cast actors whose physical bodies and identities align with the characters that they're performing? This is a much debated hot topic still to this day. And I think this play has a really interesting, complicated take on that because it does come up. So I'm going to read you this one section, but I think there's a couple of very interesting bits here. So one is, so we have Charles, who basically endorses sort of the idea that this weird sort of double idea, and this is where the tension comes, and Charles doesn't seem to be aware of it, of the double tension of what he's saying. Because on the one hand, he believes in the power of theater as art to transform. The actor can transform their body, their identity, their soul, whatever it is, to become the part that they're playing. And yet, he is opposed to the idea that an actor, that a person with a particular identity should be cast in that role. But he doesn't open the possibility that a person with a non-majority identity could be cast in any role. right? So I'll read you this section. It's a bit lengthy, but it's worth it, I think. So he's talking to Pierre, who's the stage manager. I'm not sure if that's 100% right as his job title. Yeah, he's something like he's something. He runs the theater, basically. He runs Covent Garden Theater. So he's talking to Pierre. He's talking to Ellen. We get Bernard and Henry in here as well. I may skip over Bernard and Henry. They're two actors who are on different sides of the question. But so Charles says, Pierre, acting is an art. Transformation is an art. My father, a small, physically challenged, aging man, to see him become a warrior more is an art, isn't it? People come to the theater to get away from reality, and what I mean to say is, it's a sad fact, and I'm sorry to say it, but it's true. I'm afraid that he will prevent them from escaping reality. Ellen says, they said the same about women. Charles says, oh, don't make this a crusade for every fringe cause. Ellen says, I beg your pardon? Charles says, you know what I mean, Ellen. English theater is top of the tree because within one artist, male or female, there is everything. It's a craft. We are colorless canvases on which to paint. So that's a really interesting point. And I tend to like that idea. The idea that the actor can transform themselves into a character and make it believable as the height of theatrical art. I'm sympathetic to that. That is, in fact, kind of the principle behind race-blind casting, right? So this idea, then, if followed to its logical conclusion, would suggest that it doesn't really matter that Ira Aldridge is black. He can play Othello if he can play Othello. And he can play any other Shakespeare character if he can play that character. He could play Juliet in Romeo and Juliet if the actor's body is a canvas on which to build a character, and they can build that character regardless of their own physical identity, attributes, etc. If the logic of Charles's statement is followed through here, there is no reason Aldrich can't play the part. But by the end of the page here, Charles says, in quite a different note, I'm merely saying that if you give people an option to contribute, often the wider picture gets lost and they come up with endless wandering points of view. For goodness sake, I'm talking about the future, Ellen, the policies on which we build our profession. If we bring Jews to play Shylock, blacks to play the Moor, half-wits to play Caliban, we decimate ourselves in the name of what? Fashion? Politics? Then any drunken fool on the street will play Falstaff. You, my darling, will only be allowed to play what you are. Too old for Juliet, too bland for the Queen. So this is quite an interesting distinction he's making here. The actor is a canvas on whose body can be painted any character, but only certain bodies. And this is actually where it gets kind of interesting. Charles is a dick. Don't get me wrong. I'm not endorsing his racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, etc. But it does. But this is one of the sort of debates surrounding questions of things like race-blind casting, ability-blind casting, etc. If the only opportunities that are going to be opened for actors of color is to play characters of color, then don't we risk abandoning the idea of theater as a creative art, right? Theater as a a space in which the actor can transform into someone that they aren't. If Jews are only cast to play Jewish characters, if actors with disabilities are only cast to play characters with disabilities, then doesn't that undermine the very idea that an actor is a canvas who can create out of their body and their ability, their art, these differing roles? So this becomes the problem, right? Is there's the tension. If Ira Aldridge is brought in only to play Othello, but denied opportunities to play Hamlet, to play Pericles, to play King. I'll mention King Lear because actually, in the scenes where he's dying, he is playing King Lear in whiteface. If he's denied the opportunity to play these characters because they don't align with his physical body, then it is a direct rejection of the idea that Charles promotes, that the actor can be anyone. The actor can make their identity any identity on the basis of their skill as a performer. But it then also follows that Aldrich can play Othello, not because he's black, but because he's an actor. And so this is where things start to get really paradoxical for me, and I love that paradoxical nature of this play. The ideas here, I think, are so complicated and fascinating. And it's worth noting that Aldrich himself makes this point, identifies this paradox that I've been talking about. Toward the end of the play, he says to Pierre, his old friend, "Don't you find it edifying, Pierre, that no one bats an eye when Grandma plays Juliet, and that we all applaud the East End drunk as the warrior Moor? So when Kean plays the Moor, we're amazed at how skillfully he descends into this base African tragedy, but with me it seems I'm revealing my true nature." This is an interesting double standard that, of course, is one of the many, many, many double standards that apply to people of color in predominantly white Western societies. Kean is applauded for playing Othello because it is seen as art. Aldrich is condemned for playing Othello because it is seen as true. The idea that, and this is an interesting point, because again, if Kean played Henry V, a white character, he was an English monarch, I doubt there would be any criticism that his identity was too closely aligned with the character to be believable. And so again, Aldrich faces this sort of paradox of casting and the arts, right, of being presented as incapable fundamentally of getting beyond his identity as an artist, whereas that same standard is not applied to his white colleagues.